Like and subscribe right now, or you're going to have terrible luck for the next week. Everyone knows that the world is a terrible place where a multitude of terrible things can happen. In this world, bad things happen and people get seriously hurt. However, when these bad things happen, some people still end up being extremely lucky. This is 100M, and today, we'll be looking at the survival stories of 10 interesting people. These stories aren't fiction, and they actually happened. And that's what makes them so remarkable. These are the top 10 people who survived the impossible. Number 10. The Many Lives of Frane Selak. Frane was a Croatian music teacher born in 1929. The first of his many close shaves with death was when, on a cold January day in 1962, he was on a train to Dubrovnik. The train suddenly derailed into an icy river, and 17 people died. However, Frane only escaped with a broken arm and a few scars. A year later, Frane got into an even more impossible situation. He was on a flight from Zagreb to Rijeka when a door abruptly blew off the plane. Frane was thrown off the plane in that instance, but he didn't die. He was lucky to land on a haystack. Unfortunately, 19 others weren't as lucky, and they did die. He woke up later in the hospital with some bruises and minor injuries. In 1966, he was traveling on a bus when the bus suddenly plunged into a river. Amazingly, he managed to escape this situation with his life as well. Unfortunately, 4 people were not as lucky. 4 years later, he managed to escape from his car before it caught fire and exploded in a crash. In 1995, he was hit by a bus and still managed to survive. The following year, Frane drove off a guardrail to avoid an oncoming truck and landed on a tree, only to see his car explode on the hill below. Amazingly, after going through all of this, he won the $1 million Croatian lottery in 2003. Number 9. Anatoly Bogorsky and the Particle Accelerator. No, this isn't the plot of Flash. Bogorsky was a researcher at the Institute for High Energy Physics in Protvino and used to work with the largest Soviet particle accelerator, the Signaltron U-70. One day, Bogorsky was checking out a piece of malfunctioning equipment when the worst happened. He stuck his head into the part of the machine where the proton beam was running, and the beam passed through his skull. He said he saw a flash brighter than the light of 1,000 suns, but felt no pain. It takes only 500 to 600 rads to kill a person, but this beam was about 2,000 rads. Basically, Bogorsky was certain of death, and his face began to peel off. Thankfully, he survived, but that part of his face remained frozen because of nerve damage. He had no mental problem too, and was even able to complete his PhD. Number 8. Roy Sullivan, the Lightning Magnet. Roy Sullivan was a park ranger who, throughout the course of his life, got struck by lightning 7 times, and he managed to live through them all. In 1942, the first lightning struck him and knocked his big toenail off. The second strike came in 1969 and burned off his eyebrows, leaving him unconscious. The third strike was in 1970 and seared his shoulder. 2 years later, there was yet another strike, and this one left his hair on fire. He even had to dump a bucket of water on his head to cool off. The next year, another lightning bolt ripped through his hat, hitting him on the head, sending him sprawling out of his car and knocking his left shoe off. In 1976, a 6th strike left him with an injured ankle. The last strike happened in 1977, and it sent him to the hospital with chest and stomach burns. Most people die after getting struck by lightning once, but here's a man who survived 7 thunder strikes. That's a good survival story as you'll ever hear. Number 7. Vesna Vulovic and the Fall from the Skies. If you jump down from a skyscraper, you'll almost certainly die. But not if your name is Vesna Vulovic and you're an air hostess. Confused? Don't worry, we'll explain. In 1972, 22-year-old flight attendant Vesna Vulovic survived the longest fall from a plane. The plane took off from Copenhagen on a Yugoslav Airlines flight to Belgrade and spontaneously exploded just over what is today known as the Czech Republic. Rescuers found Vesna in the smoking heap. Her leg was poking out of the wreckage, and they were quite shocked to find she was still alive. Sadly, she was the only one who did out of 28 people on board. But still, she survived. Number 6. Mauro Prosperi and the Desert. A lot of people say that the Marathon des Sables, a 6-day run through the Sahara Desert, is the toughest athletic event on Earth. And that may just be true, The race requires you to run as fast as you can through a brutal desert and under the glaring sun for 6 days. It's difficult to think of any other sporting event as tasking. In the middle of the race, he was forced by an 8-hour sandstorm to take shelter for the night. Unfortunately, in the morning, he discovered that he was lost in the desert and he had only half a bottle of water left. To survive, Mauro did a lot of unbelievable things. For example, he drank his own urine and also drank the blood of bats to quench his thirst. After 3 days had passed and he was no closer to getting rescued, he slit his wrists and hoped to die. But his blood had thickened due to dehydration, so he couldn't bleed out. Mauro took this as a sign and decided to keep walking. On the 8th day of being lost, he saw an oasis and was able to get some water to drink. The next morning, he saw some shepherds who were able to summon rescuers for him. How surreal, wouldn't you say? Number 5. 4 months at sea, the story of Poon Lim. In 1942, right in the middle of World War II, a British merchant ship called the Ben was torpedoed by a German U-boat just off the coast of South America. The only survivor of the ship was a 24-year-old seaman called Poon Lim, who jumped overboard. Lim managed to struggle to the surface and was even able to find one of the ship's rafts. He was able to locate the water tank and some cans of food in the wreckage. He was also able to improvise a fish tackle to catch more food. Number 4. Truman Duncan, the Half Man. One of the worst things that can happen to any man is to be cut in half. In fact, in medieval times, it was sometimes used as a particularly painful execution technique. Well, train technician Truman Duncan didn't have to commit a terrible crime to be cut in half. In fact, it all happened as an unfortunate accident. One day, he fell off the front of a moving train car, and he was immediately cut in two. He lost 2 legs and a kidney that day, but he was still able to awake conscious long enough to call 911. After calling 911, he was able to survive a 45-minute wait. Yes, well, literally cut in two. Fortunately, he got to the hospital on time and was able to live after 3 surgeries. Number 3. Aren Ralston. Under normal circumstances, choosing whether or not to amputate a body part is a difficult situation. And that's under normal conditions, where you have a trained doctor and a reasonable expectation of survival. But what if you're in a situation where you have to choose whether to amputate your arm or not, and you would have to do the amputation yourself? To make matters worse, if you don't do it, you could die. And if you do, you could also die. Well, that was the situation Aren Ralston found himself in after a canyoneering trip in Blue John Canyon. A boulder fell on his arm and crushing it and pinning it to the ground. After 5 days of trying to lift the boulder, Ralston was becoming desperate. He'd done everything. He'd carved his name on the boulder, drank his own urine, and even videotaped his last goodbye to his family. Finally, he decided that his only option was to cut off his arm. And that's what he did. He cut off his arm with his own hands and afterwards was able to escape. After his escape, park authorities were able to retrieve his arm. It was cremated and was given back to Ralston. Now it's time for today's best pick. This picture here was sent in by a subscriber. If you come across a picture online and want to know its origins, just send it to us. Your picture can even be our best picture in our next video. Number 2. The Man with Half a Brain. Carlos Haffy Rodriguez is a very peculiar man, and he looks pretty peculiar too. Why? Well, it probably has something to do with the fact that half his brain is missing. But how did this happen? One day, Carlos was drunk and decided that he and his cousin would steal a car. He was the one driving. Unsurprisingly, he ran into problems when he hit a pole and flew out of the car through the windshield and landed on his head. Doctors were able to save Carlos from death, but sadly they couldn't save most of his head. And that's why his head is shaped in this peculiar and perhaps horrifying way. Before we move on, I've got a little challenge for you that'll take 5 seconds to complete. So here's the deal. You just leave a like on this video, smash that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell, and you'll get 25 years of amazing luck. Try it. It really works. Number 1. Saved from Gulag. Sławomir Rawitz was a young Polish cavalry officer in the Second World War. When the USSR invaded Russia, he was captured by the Soviet army and was sent to Moscow. At Moscow, he was convicted on trumped-up charges of espionage and was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor. He was to serve his prison time in Siberia, and his journey there was brutal. He had to ride on the back of an open cattle truck in freezing cold, and then march hundreds of miles in chains. Just 2 years into his sentence, after a blizzard, he and 6 other prisoners were able to escape. After escaping, they had to trek 4,000 miles to the south. They endured starvation, heat, and extreme conditions. The journey was so brutal that 3 of the pioneers died along the way, leaving only 4 men when they finally reached India. While Rawitch never truly recovered from the mental and physical strain that the trek took on him, he was able to live until the ripe old age of 88. That's all for now, guys. If you enjoyed the video, click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. We have loads of great videos like this for you to check out. See you guys, and try to stay safe.